What's going on, and welcome to the next module of Story Selling Secrets. And so just to recap what we've looked at so far, to make sure that it's all making sense and it's all working together in your mind, I'm just going to recap really quick. So first we talked about false beliefs, right? False beliefs are these things that people carry around with them based on an experience they had and a story they told themselves, right? And so your job was to go through and identify those false beliefs and identify the stories and experiences people had, so that way you can start thinking about how your stories can overcome those false beliefs. The next thing we talked about was how the brain works in terms of hearing stories. All stories elicit dopamine because people want to hear what's coming next. But then if you tell something funny or joyful, right, then people get a rush of endorphins because it makes them feel good, right? It's always like the stories when the hero wins at the end, or the person is about to fail and they come through at the last second. That gives floods of endorphins. The other kind is empathy. Empathy is when someone feels for you, when someone feels like they can put themselves in your shoes, right? That's empathy. We talked about how those work, and we wrote down your stories, and we broke them into the two categories. Which stories belong in the empathy category, and which stories belong in the endorphins category, right? After we talked about those, we talked about the different elements of a story. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every story has a character, a desire, and a conflict. Then when you tell your stories, you want to tell the incident, right? You want to tell the story. You want to give the people you're telling it to an action or a point, and then you want to tell them the benefits of understanding or of taking that action after the fact. So that's everything that we've covered so far. And so now, and you went through and labeled those within your stories. And so now we're going to get into talking about how to tell the stories in a way that people actually will resonate with, and you'll be able to get them to change their beliefs. And so really quick, I'm going to tell you a story about, what was it, about February. So it's probably 9 months ago. 9 months ago, I went to a conference out in San Diego, and it was a guy named Alex Moscow, who's a high ticket coach. He's 29 years old, making like 750 grand a year, just balling, right? And at the event, he had a guy there that was going to speak on a stage, and this guy was a LinkedIn expert, right? He was a master at LinkedIn, how to generate leads from LinkedIn. He had his 10-day fast start program and all this stuff, right? And so I remember I was pretty excited about the guy, talking about LinkedIn, because that's a great way to get customers for what I do. And so he goes up there, and I'm sitting there and like, I just want to learn how this works. How does LinkedIn work? How can I use it to take advantage? Because I know Facebook and, the advertising part of things, but how does this work, right? And so I'm like excited. I'm hoping that I can get some good value and some good knowledge out of this thing. The guy goes up on stage, and he starts talking. And as soon as he started telling his story, he started off telling a story about when he was a little kid. And he's like, it was ridiculous, man. He's up there and he's like, when I was a little kid, my dad used to drink every day. And I remember coming home one day, and my dad was so drunk, he was passed out on the table. Can you guys imagine what that little boy was thinking to see his dad drunk, passed out on the table? And that's how he told his story. He went through this, and I remember at that point when he said that, can you imagine how that little boy was feeling? I remember I looked around the room, and 90%, he lost 90% of the room in that moment. Like I looked around, and people were like, other people were whispering comments to each other, and he lost the room at that moment. And I was sitting there, and I was just thinking, I was like, man, this dude had some good information. Like, I listened to the rest of his speech. I'm sitting there, I'm thinking like, man, this dude had some good information to give, but his delivery sucked, right? His delivery sucked, and he paid for it because not as many people bought his program. He ended up making an offer at the end, and not as many people bought his program as the people that could have used it, right? But then you take that and you contrast it to the guy who was hosting the event, the guy named Alex. And Alex, when he first goes on stage, he talks about how he was a little kid. And when he was a little kid, he had a stuttering problem, like a severe stuttering problem. He even has it still now, but it's a little better. He has these triggers and things that he does to stop himself from stuttering. And he was talking about his first day in class, and he's in kindergarten, and he's sitting there, and he was so excited to go to school and meet new kids and meet new friends, and he was pumped up. And he remembers this teacher was standing at the front of the room, and she's going through asking all the kids, "Hey, what's your name? Introduce yourself," all that stuff. And so he remembers he was watching the kids, and he was just this nervous, shy little kid. And when she asked the kid before him, the kid stands up, "Hey, my name's Josh. I love my mom. I love my dad. And I really love playing video games and da-da-da-da-da," right? This kid sits down. And then he says, "I remember the teacher turned to me, and she looked at me, and she says, 'Okay, young man, what's your name? Introduce yourself.'" And he's like, "I sat there in complete terror. And my heart was pounding. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. And when I finally started to say something, I said, and then I started crying, and I couldn't say my name. I couldn't say my name in front of the class. And I remember hearing the other kids laughing and saying, "This kid can't even speak." And I remember I got up, I ran out of the classroom, I opened the door, and I just sat there outside of the classroom crying. Okay, I got into the story a little bit. I'm sorry, guys. But Alex, okay, that's how he's told his story, his initial story, versus the other guy who was, could you imagine the little kid? Okay. At the end of the event, check this out. On everything, man, I am telling you guys the truth. At the end of the event, Alex was selling 2 programs. One was a $25,000 program. The other was a $60,000 program. At the end of the event, he sold over 25 people into his programs. Now, some of them bought the $60,000 program. Some of them bought the $25,000 program. But if you do the math, so check this out, if everyone in there only bought the $25,000 program, let's do the math. What's 25,000 times 25? 250,000, 500,000, $625,000 for a 3-day weekend, 3-day event. I'd say that's pretty freaking good, right? And it was all about the power of his story and the power of his offer. Those 2 things are what sold people into that event, or sold people into that course. There were some other things that if you're in Offer University, or if you're in some of my other courses, the Persuasion Hacks course, or some of the other things, I tell other parts that added to the offer and really made that a very compelling offer that I almost bought, even though I didn't have $25,000 or $60,000 to invest at the time, but I was this close to buying because, man, it was powerful. But it was his story and it was the offer. Those were the 2 things that made him over $625,000 in freaking 3 days, in 3-day event. It was crazy. And so I tell you that whole backstory to get back to the purpose of this lesson. This lesson, I'm going to talk about how to deliver emotion in your story. And this is one of the biggest things that people miss when they're telling stories. You might know how to structure your story. You might know how to tell good stories and all this stuff. But if you can't get people involved, if you can't get them picturing and being a part of it, experiencing it with you, then you'll never be able to crush their false beliefs. And so there's 3 main things that we're going to focus on. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my notes really quick. So the first thing we're going to talk about is using the senses, right? We all have our senses, right? We have taste, right? Touch, smell, see, and hear, right? We all have those senses, and so, some better than others, but for the most part, we all have those same senses. And so when you're telling your stories, the more senses you can give, the more that you will bring your audience in. So if I tell you about a time I was nervous before playing a football game, and I say I was nervous before the game, and we went out and we ended up beating our rival, that's does nothing for you, right? But if I say, man, I remember it was a late October evening, and we were playing our rival, and if we lost the game, we wouldn't make the playoffs. And I remember before the game, I was looking at my coach, man, and I could see like the intensity in his eyes, and my heart was beating fast, and I could feel my palms were sweating because I was nervous. This moment meant so much. And as I walked out, and I heard the clink of my cleats on the cement, clink, 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 and as I approached the grass, I took a big whiff, and I could smell the freshly cut grass and feel the cold air on my skin. And I remember looking across the field, and these guys were in white jerseys and black pants, and they had this guy named Mike Smith, and Mike Smith was 6'6", 250 pounds, and he walked around with a swagger, like his shoulders back, his chest out, and his arms just swinging from side to side. And this was the guy that I was going to have to block all night. He ended up going to Nebraska and being a Division I offensive lineman. And I remember standing there, and I tried to get myself hyped up, but the thing was, like, my brain was like in chaos mode, right? Have you ever been in one of those situations where you're trying to think, and get yourself in the mode, but you keep having this self-doubt, and the self-doubt feels like a weight just holding you down and pulling you back and trying to hold you down against the ground, and you're just fighting it with every fiber of your being. All right. So using the senses, the smell, the taste, the touch, the feeling. How did it feel? I felt that sick feeling in my gut, where I felt my heart pounding against my chest, where I felt sweat dripping down my palms, right? So that's the first thing, is use the senses. The senses are what we have in common. We all have those things in common, that our desires, the thing that we desire, right? We all have a need for certainty, uncertainty, significance, connection, growth, and contribution. Those are all come from Tony Robbins, the 6 human needs. We all have the same needs, and we all have the same senses, right? How we get to experience the world with our body. Okay, so that's the first thing that you want to use, is using the senses. The next thing is tonality. Tonality is the way that you use your voice. And so the comparison between the two guys at the event was, the one guy was talking like this, like I'm talking to a bunch of little kids, and can you guys see how this isn't going to really help me get my point across unless I'm on a PBS TV show, right? Versus, I remember, man, this day, she was gone. She was gone. Okay. The way in which you say things is extremely important. This is still debated, right? It's still debated, but they say that 7% of communication is what you say. Only 7% is what you say. 32% is how you say it, and then the rest is your body language. And so when you're communicating with the world, right, only 7% is what you say. So if I said, hey, man, you're a dork. Hey, you're a dork. You're such a dork, right? It's not about what I say. A lot of it is about how I say it and how you say it. And so when you're telling your stories, you want to think about how you're delivering the message. When do you use a pause to keep people's attention, right? You use a pause to get people, when you're telling a story or when you're talking to someone, you use a pause, because that silence reverts their attention, right? And you use a pause when you want to make a point. How do you use your voice getting louder? And when do you quiet down to bring people in, right? Because a whisper brings people in. When you get loud, you make the senses, right? You make people feel it, right? People can feel it. And so you want to start learning how to use your voice to prove your points, to portray, to get your message across, right? So there's something called a test closing. If you're in my Persuasion Hacks course, man, you get that all with Offer University. But if you're in Persuasion Hacks, I go a lot into test closing, and it's like it's a powerful tool. But I'm going to skip that for now. I just wanted to touch on it. But like, what happens when you end with an upward inflection, right? So if I'm like kind of nervous, my voice will always go like this, right? Or if I'm being serious, then my voice will finish the words in a downward inflection. Can you see how powerful this really is? Right? So we covered using the senses, and we covered tonality. The third thing that we're going to cover is gestures, right? And gestures are tricky because we all have gestures, right? We all use gestures. And if you look like you're trying to use gestures and pretending to do all this stuff, right, you're going to lose your audience. Like if you see someone that's over the top and it's not natural and they're trying to do all this stuff and they're overly trying to portray their stuff, right, it looks unnatural. But we all have natural things that we do in our gestures. And there's if you get into like the whole NLP thing and like subconscious cues and triggers and modalities, and there's a whole field of study that you can go into that I'm not going to touch on in this because it's way more advanced than what we're trying to accomplish here. But there's a lot of things like there's a book called The Ellipsis Manual, and it was written by a guy that was a lead trainer for the CIA, FBI, all this stuff. And basically what he did is he taught field operators how to basically put hypnotic trances on people, how to elicit confessions, all these things. And he used body language and he used all this stuff. But when you're using your gestures, there's certain things that you do. I'll teach you just a few. So when you're making a point, right? Say you want people to buy, you want them to go to the back of the room. So every time you say something about buying, you're telling them where to go, right? So man, when you buy this program, it's going to change your life. It's really going to help you do this, this, and this. And when you invest today, right? And so you're telling them where to go with your gestures. And then like, there's another thing you can do when you're making a point of like a positive attribute. You can pull that to yourself. So when you guys see the opportunity to really invest and be a part of something special, so you're associating subconsciously, people don't even know this is going on, but subconsciously you're associating what you're saying with you or with whatever you're pointing at. Another thing is like, if you point at someone, right? If you point at someone, that creates a feeling of like pressure and a feeling of like you're what's the word for it? Almost animosity, right? So if you point at someone, like you're like, yeah, go over there, right? That creates animosity between you and another person subconsciously, right? Just by you going like, yeah, go over there, right? If you have your hand out like this, that it's not like doesn't create the same amount of animosity, but it's still a little bit of like a it's like a pressing motion, right? So it makes people feel not completely welcome. So if someone comes in and they're like, where's the bathroom? You're like, over there, right? But this way, if you open your hand and say, bathroom's right over there, and you open your hand, that makes people feel welcome. And you can study body language. This isn't a body language course, but I do want you to understand that using your gestures to accentuate, who does this? To accentuate the things that you say is paramount in your speech, and people will absolutely love it because they'll be able to see how special what you're saying really is. Okay, so just to review, we talked about using the senses. We talked about tonality, how you say the things that you say. And we talked about using your gestures to accentuate the points that you want to make and to bring people in or to push people away or to move people or to uh, show people or to demonstrate, right? You can use these gestures in all these different ways. Just make sure that they're natural and they don't come across as like superficial or fake. And with that, your homework in this lesson is to go practice telling one of your stories. And the specific story that I want you to tell is your origin story, okay? Your origin story of how you got started in your business. And remember all the elements that you want to have in it, right? You want to see what the false belief is that people might have about your business. You want to see what the experience is, and then you want to tell your backstory. You want to tell the experience that you had, the conflict, and you want to have a point at the end. So everything that we've covered up till now, I just want you to go practice telling your origin story. I haven't given you the story structure yet. That's what I'll give you in the next lesson. But I want you to go practice without knowing the structure. Just go practice. See if you can start putting all these things together. That's your homework for today, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.